Excerpt, you know.
Okay, we are rolling. Today is Sunday, May 18th, 2003. We're here at the Barron residence with Brent Jackson. Talk about Camp Becket in the 1960s. Roll it, Rich. Hi, Brent.
Hi, Rich.
You started it in 1964, is that correct?
Correct.
And that was the you graduated?
Yes.
From
Tufts.
Tufts. There was something in your yearbook. I'll start with this. It was next to your 1964 photograph, and it was OSR 004. Does that ring a bell at all?
Oh, well, that was the order of surf rats. It was, well, every summer camp, there's always some little in-group that forms. And I'm not real sure how this one happened. It seems to me it was a couple of junior staff members, and they made little wooden mouse things or rat things with long leather tails on them, and you could wear them on your shoulder. I'm not exactly sure what you did after that, but everybody who was awarded one of these got a number.
Okay. You were an Iroquois counselor for 2 years?
Mm-hmm.
And what was camp like when you first got to camp? What were your first impressions of Camp Becket?
Well, it was so much bigger than the camp I'd been to as a kid that it was a little astounding how big it was and how many people there were. Although I got there the week before staff work week started, and there were really very few people there. Bouch and his wife had come back from the Peace Corps, and they were in charge, but they'd been in South America someplace, and their Texas and Oklahoma accents had been badly corrupted to the point where I had a hard time understanding them. There were also some people from Oklahoma and this weird man from Arkansas who were the first people I met, and it sounded to me like they were talking code. "Mickey, we got another one!" And I quite honestly wasn't sure what I was in for.
You're referring to Mickey Clampett, I take
Yes.
it? So you met Mickey at Camp Becket?
Right.
You didn't know him beforehand. You gave us an impression of what Mickey, your
No, that was somebody else. That was
Right.
one of the guys from Oklahoma.
What was what kind of relationship did you form with Mickey?
Well, he was one of the strangest people I'd ever met at this point. I'd never seen anybody wearing a winter coat, carrying a clipboard, and wearing boots, giving orders as if he knew what he was doing. And for somebody who was a Harvard student, it just was an interesting combination. There was a lot of people actually that year in 1964 who met each other for the first time there and who stayed friends for a long time. Bill Boulding was one of them. Chico was there. He'd been there for a few years already. But I think in '64 it was a very strong staff, interestingly enough. Not that others haven't been, but '64 I think was particularly good, with a lot of people who hung around the organization for quite a long time.
Did you find Camp Becket, or did John Schellenberger find you?
An ex-staff member of Camp Becket found me. I was in school with him, and we were going on a field trip to the White Mountains late at night, riding in the back of some beat-up old car, and this guy turned to me and he said, "So what are you doing this summer?" And I said, "I don't know." And he immediately started to talk about Becket. And I said, "Well, that sounds pretty interesting, but it's late and I'm tired and we're going to climb Mount Washington tomorrow." And about 4 days later, I got a note from Don saying that this guy had called him and said, "Here's somebody you want to talk to for the staff." And it was fairly late in the spring, too. So it was a little surprising. So I guess it was dumb luck.
Do you remember anything of your first interview with Don, your first meeting?
It was a very dingy building, and he was a lot sunnier than the surroundings. No, what I remember was that he was clearly having ambivalence about whether to hire me or not. And when we talked about it later, he said, because it was so late in the season, that he wasn't really pushed to have people. He had a couple of slots open. He said that he didn't need to hire me. There was no reason to, but there wasn't any reason not to. And his criteria, at least on me, and he said he used it on other people as well, was, would I like to spend the day in a car driving someplace with this person? And he decided yes, so he hired me.
Evidently, you grew on Don quickly, because after only 2 years as a counselor, you were put in the post as Pioneer Village Director in '66.
Mm-hmm.
Was that your choice, Pioneer, or?
No, of course not.
No. That was
Don only let you think it was your choice.
So that was Don's suggestion? He asked?
Well, I don't know what the configuration had been, but for '66 there was a village director, and I think it was somebody who'd been contracted to do Ranger, who late in the season had canceled. So he, in a Don-like way, maneuvered who was left and moved, actually it was someone new, Dick Hyde, from Pioneer to Ranger, and opened up Pioneer. And I suppose in some ways I was probably a good choice, because I basically knew all the kids who were in Pioneer that year. But I remember with, I don't know, 10 days warning before I left, thinking, I got to get rid of all this Indian stuff, and I got to go find out about all these other guys now, Bill Cody and Lewis and Clark. And darn, I was just getting this Indian stuff down.
And just as you got the Pioneer persona down in '68, after 2 years up in Pioneer,
You've been doing your homework.
you moved up to Ranger. That
Right.
was Mickey had been doing it prior to that,
Right.
and he was doing his thesis, I believe. In
Now, that was, Mickey did his thesis in '66. He did the research, so he was at camp, but he wasn't doing anything
Okay.
in part of the structure. He was the observer.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what he did in '67, but in '67
he was the Ranger
Right,
Village
right,
Director,
right.
yeah.
And I did '68. And that was the beginning of the turbulent times in the country and in camp. Mickey is still one of my best friends, but Don looked at me and he said, well, in the summer of '67 in Ranger Village we had freedom and responsibility. He said, I think maybe you just need to concentrate on the responsibility.
So that was
I had a fine time in Ranger. I didn't have any problems at all, relatively. I mean, 14-year-olds are a different ballgame than 12-year-olds. But I think maybe Ranger Village was one of the more difficult jobs I did at camp, but maybe the most rewarding.
Really?
Yeah.
After the 1 year up in Ranger, you went to Nature Director.
That was Moose's idea.
Moose's idea, okay.
Well, for the previous, 3 or 4 years, Phil Stanton had been there doing Nature with an incredible menagerie of animals. Early morning get up and milk the cows for cabins and feed the chickens and ride the horses, and a huge number of animals. And Moose, I think, realized that that was going to be a real change the next year. Phil didn't come back. So he probably figured that I could scratch together some animals from the Science Museum where I worked, which I did. Not nearly that many. No way was I going to do that. And just said, well, have I got a job for you? Period. End of decision-making process.
This was when Nature was still up in Gibson Hall?
Well, yeah, Phil had both Gibson Hall and the farmhouse and the barn, and he built 2 or 3 extra structures down by the snake pit and the nature hut that were down by the water for his prize show. I don't know what they were, chickens or whatever. So the stuff was really spread around quite a lot, but I decided not to use the farmhouse for animals. That was just too much, too far away.
You mentioned it was Moose's idea to move you into that role. Moose was there prior to you, and Moose was there after your tenure at camp?
Yeah, Moose showed up, I think, in '65, and then stayed for years and years and years. Well, any number of people came and went. Absolutely.
What were your impressions of Moose?
Well, he was really well organized, and that was a good thing. He also was very, when you saw him working with kids, you realized how much he was really seeing what it was he could do to make sure that the kids had a good experience. And that other than some rules about swimming, that there were no rules about what activities you did and if you wanted to change or not change, or, you know, he was the guidance counselor, but it was the kid's decision, and that was just really impressive. Of course, he had a couple old hackneyed ideas that he kept dragging up, especially when you were a village director and looking for an all-village activity. He'd always suggest 2 or 3 things that no one ever did, because nobody ever wanted to do Bunko Day or whatever those other things were. But he had a huge amount of interesting things that he could tell you about if you asked, in terms of planning programs.
72 was your last year there?
71.
71.
Yeah.
In an official capacity?
Mm-hmm.
And after that, where did you go on to?
After that, I needed my day job needed me to be there in the summertime. But I came back a lot and was there and worked often for family camp, and over the winter I would be up there when the outdoor center was just starting. You'd get a frantic phone call from Bob McMaster who said, "Quick, I need somebody next weekend who can teach whatever, bugs or trees or porcupines or whatever." So there was a little group of us who went back fairly often, but not for the whole summer for several years.
One term that I learned when I was a camper, and I don't know if it came from you, was a grok. Was that something you brought to camp?
I don't think I did. I knew what it was as soon as I'd heard it. I mean, I knew what the reference had come from. I don't remember. It could have been Bob McMaster, or it could have been, well, maybe it was Bob and I together. It showed up as part of an outdoor education curriculum that had been written out of the Midwest, and grok was a piece of that program. So I don't know if Bob found it first or I found it first or whatever, but
We were talking about this a little bit earlier. Everybody at camp, especially village directors, have a persona or a nickname. Yours was the Abbot.
yes.
Tell us how you got the
Well, quite
the
by
nickname,
accident.
Abbot.
Quite by accident. When I moved into Pioneer Village that year, they had replaced the building that the village director lived in. And so a new building showed up with no name on it. And that was fine until campers or staff or whoever started to realize that every other village, the cabin had a name. And what was the name of this one? So we had a contest. Now remember, these are, 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds? And I put a camper CIT staff group in charge of collecting names and winnowing down the list. And at the end of the process, they came up with the Abbey and Versailles, which were perhaps 2 of the names I would have least expected to see. And because we all decided that Versailles wasn't easily spelled, we decided on the Abbey, which seemed to solve that problem at one level. And it wasn't for a period of time, although I think that same summer, but probably late, that I got first outfitted as the abbot in a very makeshift manner at the beginning of a very large pushball event on the main ball field. And Mickey just sort of draped me with some leftover curtains and said, "You're the abbot now, get out there and bless your troops." And I can't remember if it was a Pioneer Frontier event or an all-camp event or whatever, but it took off at that point. Again, I was a little surprised because certainly all the other nicknames for other people over the years had been very much more, well, based on animals or bad pronunciations of their name or something else, and often had a noise associated with it that was not always a great thing. So this whole thing was very much an accident.
So when you were announced at the dining hall for an announcement, what was the noise or cheer that they would give you? Could you
Oh, well, why don't you
demonstrate
do it
that
for us?
I know.
All together now. Abbot, 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 abbot.
Yeah, you had the way to stop it. That was
Right, and that made it slightly different and more controllable, yes.
Yeah, that worked out well.
And that stuck with me, even though, you know, I stopped being a village director and went to nature and all that stuff.
Even as the nature director, you were still
The abbot.
remembered as the abbot.
Typecasting is a terrible thing.
You mentioned that 1968, I think, is the year that you singled out as the world was changing and it had big influence.
Well, yeah, I've been thinking about that. It was the time when Vietnam was happening, and if you think of the fact that the camp staff was made up of mostly college students, and then you say, well, what was it that they were doing the rest of the year? And not being a sociologist or a historian, the best I can figure is students who were on college campuses who were opposed to the Vietnam War were in a position where they probably felt helpless about what was going on with their world and their inability to do anything about it. And so on college campuses there was lots of noise and lots of building occupations and whatever, none of which actually directly affected what was going on in Southeast Asia, but it made people feel, I think, that they were doing something to try to influence what was going on. And I think that was something very hard to leave behind when you came to camp. So they got to camp, and I don't know that they were protesting Vietnam still, but there were different ways to show that. One of them was to downplay authority. So automatically the camp administration became the authority, and it was sort of, they're not going to tell me what to do with my life. And what was different about it from, you know, you being a college student and being a camp counselor was that now there was another layer of kids involved. So I can remember watching during the Becket Olympics one of those years, I don't remember which, there were 2 or 3 counselors who said, my cabin isn't going to participate in this because they're not going to tell me what to do on the 4th of July. And so they sat on the banking at the ball field and watched. And while the staff that were doing that may have felt really good about things, the campers were sitting there not understanding what was going on and saying, how come I'm not down there representing Bulgaria or whatever. So it was awkward at that point, but it was that same kind of protest against authority that carried over. And Don later said that was the period when he was most tempted to just hang it up and walk away. He'd always thought that he had the perfect job, perfect career path, being a camp director. And he said he came so close to just saying, this isn't worth it anymore. And I think he was coming at it a little bit from the camper's point of view. But he didn't give it up. He stuck it out for a few more years and got over it.
The camps weren't really as insulated from Vietnam and
No.
the 60s as we may have remembered we were.
Well, there were probably fewer televisions in camp. There were no computers, so getting information on a daily basis was a little bit more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
If you knew who got the subscription to the Berkshire Eagle, maybe you could go and read that, but it was a little bit more insulated, but every place was a little bit more insulated in terms of daily news, but not completely, no.
Now, the next year was the moon landing. You were the nature director. What big event did
I
you
was in
plan?
charge of the moon that year.
There you go. What happened?
Well, again, there weren't as many ways to access that, so I don't remember where this television set came from. I think it may have come from the infirmary. We took it to Gibson Hall and set it up and tried to close off as much of the light as we could. And we watched as much of the moon landing as we could, and I think that whole next couple of days, it just got repeated and repeated and repeated. And I was just there supposedly to provide color commentary. And it was, anybody could drop in, anybody could come during the afternoon that it was set up. It was just on.
Oh, I think I can, I was actually there. The actual, when they stepped foot on the moon, it was late at night.
Yes.
And we as campers came with sleeping bags up to Gibson Hall.
Yep.
And I don't know if you were involved in the process, but I know a lot of counselors were like batting us to stay awake.
Yes.
This is history.
Yeah. The thing, I remember doing that, but I think the thing that sticks in my mind even more clearly was several years later at Chimney Corners when there were Russians from a youth organization in Russia who were at both camps during the summer. There had been Russians actually in 1964 as visitors, and I'd never met a real Russian before, and I said, well, what am I getting myself into here? So the Russians came back in '76 and spent several days, some at Becket, some at Chimney Corners, and I was at Chimney Corners when the Apollo-Soyuz capsules hooked up live, and the astronauts climbed through with the cosmonauts and all that stuff. And I remember these Soviet youth workers standing there and saying, when did this happen? And I kept trying to explain to them that this was real time. And as Russians, they had never seen anything happen in the space program real time. And they didn't believe me because they'd all seen stuff that was recorded and they didn't ever see the accidents and whatever. So I remember that one way more clearly than the moon landing. But you're right, I wasn't going to miss it. So I was going to do everything I could to make sure I was there. And of course, if I was going to be there, everybody else could be there too. Gibson Hall was big enough.
What other, were there any other people that you can think of? We talked a little bit about Moose and Mickey, Don Schoenberger when he initially interviewed you. Anybody else that stood out as somebody that was extremely talented or made a large impression on you while you were at camp?
Well, there was a lot of people who were talented. There was no question about that. I can think of a couple. Paul Macklin was one who probably was the most competent music director the camp had seen maybe ever. And what he was able to do with a bunch of scraggly put together voices was truly astounding. And the rumor is that on his application to graduate school, he alluded to the fact that he may have conducted a semi-professional chorus in the Berkshires. We're not sure that's true, but it's reputed. Flip side, Dick Smith. I spent a fair amount of time with Dick Smith over that period of time. He was always, when I was there, the Iroquois village director for many of those years, and many more, actually. And we inevitably spent time working on the big show together. He always gives me more credit than I deserve because I think he worked on it all year long and then would allow me to help him fine-tune it. But he was just very inventive and really, really good working with Iroquois and giving them a personality and not letting them be run over by the herds of bison and cougars and whatever in the main camp. And bringing sort of some very interesting playfulness to Iroquois village, sort of letting kids be kids. And that spread throughout the whole camp. I mean, you could, being very cynical, say that it was all very hokey, but it all worked, and it worked really well. So who cares what you call it?
Any other stories or memories that you have that kind of really stand out, going back maybe to the 60s or even in the later years? But
well, I was talking earlier about Old Becket Day, and I'm having a hard time remembering what Old Becket Day was. But even in the 60s and 70s, people were trying to remember what it must have been like when the camp was new, and there were all these old films kicking around, and there were pictures and whatever. So people had a little bit of a sense. Most campers probably didn't have a real good idea of what the time frame really was. But you get up in the morning, and flag raising would include calisthenics on Old Becket Day, and people would yank their pant legs up to make them look like knickers, and raid the costume room to see if there was anything that could make them look like a little junior version of Henry Gibson. It was probably terribly ineffective. And it seems to me that was the day that we did the all-camp blueberry pick, which probably had been a much bigger deal when the camp property was new and wasn't as forested as it is now, and blueberry bushes just got choked out by the trees over the years. But we picked blueberries, and we probably had vespers in the evening that day and had a rousing good campfire with some old hokey games in it. But I'm not quite sure. That seems to me there was something else, but I can't remember what it was. But that always happened. And that was usually timed somewhere close to when Alumni Weekend used to be, which was the weekend before the end of camp. Although that seems tough to mock the people who were there by pretending to be what they used to look like when they had been campers. I don't know.
Going back to your first years there when you were a camp counselor in Iroquois Village at the age of
naive.
19, 20 years old. Anything that you can look back then and look at as something that would never be appropriate or politically correct today?
Well, I think probably when I started, and it had been going for a while, the whole performance stuff around being Iroquois Indians probably wouldn't fly today. We tried to be authentic, but it's hard to be authentic Iroquois when they start out by giving you some bad old Sioux war bonnets and bring your own blanket. None of us really knew very much about Native Americans, let alone the differences between groups. And here we were, Iroquois, and then there were all the cabins, some of which were parts of the Iroquois Nation and some of which were not. And we stood around and made all those bad jokes, while wrapped in a blanket. And I think that probably shouldn't fly anymore.
Any campers that stood out when you were either a village director or even a counselor that were, I don't know, special or different or maybe difficult to deal with? Or?
Oh, there were always campers who fit all those categories. It would be unfair. I'm thinking, earlier you mentioned a camper who was in my cabin, and he was never a bad camper, but he just couldn't get his act together very much, either schedule or wearing matching socks or remembering to put his pants on frontwards, or he was just bumbling. And you mentioned that you'd just seen him at one of the centennial dinners, and he's fairly successful now, and it would be unfair to say his name.
No, I wasn't looking for specific names. Of
no,
anybody,
there
but
certainly were campers who were, well, they came from a whole variety of places. And there were kids who were at camp because their parents were in the middle of getting divorced. And there were kids who were at camp in the next bunk who came from the most solid, good old New England families who had been sending kids to Becket for 3 generations that you'd ever heard of. And they showed up on the first day and they were all alike. But there were plenty of differences to keep you busy. And in Iroquois, of course, you had the additive incentive of Pee-wee Patrol for kids who wet their bed. Although the longer I hung around Becket, the more I found out that it wasn't always restricted to Iroquois. It got to be a bigger problem as you moved up, but...
Iroquois too young to tell him about the one-armed brakeman?
No.
No.
No. One of the things that Don, I think, did when he got to Becket, and this is based mostly on hearing stories from people who were there during the years before Don got there and after. One of the things that Don, I think, didn't really like was that whole ghost story thing. He said, why would any adult in their right mind tell kids ghost stories late at night and then expect them to sleep? So the one-armed brakeman kind of fell into that category, but I get the feeling that it may have been a more prominent character role in the late 50s. So that was one of the kinds of things. He sort of said, there's a lot of things that we can have a good time with, and there's a lot of things that are, quote, good for you, and do the character development stuff. Why are we bothering with all this other stuff? There's plenty that we can do that's equally fun. I sometimes feel guilty about having been certainly one of the people in Becket history who ever ran a snipe hunt, usually in Iroquois. Snipe hunts are not unique to Becket. They happen around the world. I've heard of some incredibly cruel versions that happen to adults in the South. So in that sense, the Becket version was relatively benign.
Maybe you could, for those of us that don't know what a snipe hunt is, maybe you could run us through a Becket snipe hunt.
Well, I'm not sure. I don't have my pith helmet with me.
Your stones.
And my stones, right. It's been a long time. I think it was an event that was created because when you have kids at camp for a month at a time, you want to make sure that there's some variation in terms of what kinds of things happen, and perhaps even at what time of day they happen. So a snipe hunt was a manufactured event in this case, where for several days reportings of the rare snipes. I believe we even had albino snipes a couple of times. Now, a snipe is a perfectly legitimate animal, a bird. Wilson's snipe is perfectly fine. It's not terribly huge. So there'll be reports that they've been seen, and if we were lucky, maybe we would catch one, and we'll let you know. And the way to attract them is to get some stones. And it's amazing what kids learned probably about rocks in the process. And you would need to have 2 stones that you could click together, and it varied about what you chanted while you did it. Here, snipey, 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 or whatever. But it was true that if you got 2 really good pieces of quartz or granite, there was a very different sound when you clicked them together as opposed when you got to some shale or whatever. And so kids, if nothing else, learned a little bit about rocks in the process. And then, of course, you'd go locally and borrow a chicken someplace and get some burlap bags and get kids up very late at night to run back and forth across the ball field catching a chicken. Now, generally, it was prearranged as to who might catch it. Sometimes there were one or two options. And they were generally, this is where it's the good version, where you would decide on one or two kids who perhaps needed a little morale boost, or they needed a little community appreciation, or they needed a little bump up in their status. And lo and behold, you know, you might be the counselor assigned to stay with this camper. And at some point, of course, somebody was going to, you know, trade you the burlap bag with the chicken for the empty one that you and this kid were holding by ripping it out of your hands. And then by shining the light through the outside of the burlap bag and letting everybody look in, you could see that there was something alive in the bottom. But of course, it was always very important to get these specimens, you know, shipped out to the Berkshire Museum very quickly to be prepared and shipped off to the museum in Boston, or sometimes we sent them to the Smithsonian or whatever. And sure enough, if you go to any of those places, you can find a stuffed snipe. It doesn't look a lot like a chicken, but if you're 9, who remembers? Right. So it's in one sense a fairly cruel kind of thing to do. But there you have it.
Mm-hmm. Anything else that you want to add?
I would like to, it was very interesting, you were talking before about the contrasts you observed among your peers of those who served under the Vern Harper administration and then under Don Schellenberger, or even perhaps earlier than Vern Harper. Are there any other observations? You came on board 2 years into Don's reign as camp director, and as you went along, you must have picked up other tidbits and got a sense of the direction that Don was taking the camp versus where it was before. And my feeling is there was a stark contrast. And if you saw that, could you elaborate?
Yeah, I don't know that I even met the director who preceded Don. And what I sensed was that it wasn't that he was bad and trying to do something different. I think it was that he hadn't, certainly at the end of the 50s and into the 60s, certainly wasn't paying attention to the details of how things were working the way somebody else might have. And so things were falling through the cracks. So one way that that manifested itself was that during the first 2 or 3 years that Don was there, the camp was not full. And it hadn't been full for quite a long time. That attendance has slipped in the 50s and into the very early 60s. And one of the things that was on Don's agenda was to get it back up where the camp was full. And my sense is that some of that slippage may have been to some of the stuff that just didn't have enough attention paid to it. So, for example, the classic story from people who seem to have worked well under the previous administration and who worked perfectly well with Don was that Iroquois cabin Erie would be going to Rocky Point for an overnight, and it would be, here camper, you carry the frying pan, you carry the food for supper, and oh, you camper, pick up that 6-pack and throw it in your back and carry the beer for the counselor for the overnight. And that was a story that sort of, I guess we heard enough times, it became kind of emblematic of things were just kind of loose. Nobody was planning it, I think, to be loose or negative or anything other than what you would hope a YMCA camp would be. But somebody just wasn't watching. And when nobody's sort of doing quality control, things slip.
You were also on the executive committee to the camp, the board?
In its several permeations. Yeah, the first time I worked with it, there was a camp committee, period. And I was the president of the Alumni Association for a while, and as such was on that board. It was, I think, a very old school setup, that all the people who got together twice a year to have dinner really didn't make very many decisions. I think that was done with a much smaller group of people. And then over the years that structure changed to represent both the legal responsibility pieces of the puzzle of who actually owns the resources of the camp to look out for them, and a variety of committees that were advisory to various aspects of the program. And that was probably a much better organization for getting information out of people that was useful. So there was a camp committee and an outdoor center committee and an international programs committee that were all designed to help the people on the staff running those pieces benefit from the collective wisdom.
You served on those committees in the 80s and 90s, on and off?
Yep.
That's also been a time of very large-scale transition for the two camps, from just a summer camp facility to a much more year-round. How was your experience? Or
well, I think it was, there were two things happening at once when that shift started to happen. In people's heads, they said, we have this incredible facility. We use it big time in the summer. It's a shame that we can't use it more during the year so that more people can enjoy what we've got and do the kinds of things that we do. But in their hearts, they wanted to keep it as a summer camp that was just sort of special, isolated. Somebody had used the term brigadoon. And so you looked at all these people who might be coming in during the long season as parasites. What do they know? They don't know about the good stuff. So part of you wanted to develop the idea, and part of you wanted to hold on to sort of that magic summer thing. And that was tough for a while because individual people made decisions one by one about how they felt about it. I think there was some fiscal reality to it. One of the benefits of it is that you get some year-round staff that benefit everybody, including the summer people, that you couldn't have before. You probably get some better maintenance and some better stewardship of the resources because there are people there, a lot of people there all the time. You also wear them out a little bit faster too. It was not an easy transition. It was one that was going to need to happen because summer camps in the 60s and 70s were closing because they couldn't fiscally stay in operation. And one of the ways to ensure that you could was to use the property more during the year. So it was inevitably going to happen. And there were some people who went kicking and screaming, and others of us who said, fine, let's go. So here we are, year round.
yeah,
As Don used to say occasionally when he would pull out the year-round operation and the ICEP program, he said, why, we're an international YMCA with operations on 4 continents. When people started to give him a little bit of grief about just being some little summer place in the Berkshires.
I want to talk about, until recent years, last couple of years, construction of new facilities was pretty intermittent, but there seemed to be a lot that happened in the 60s, and again I want to go back to Don. I think he was instrumental, but maybe others were too, in new waterfront, new dining hall, all new cabins for all the villages. What are your recollections of upgrading the camps and the way you saw that from 64 onwards, improving the infrastructure?
My sense is that when Don was hired, that was probably a piece of his job description. I'm not sure about all the pieces of upgrade that happened in the 60s, but I know that there were state regulations in Massachusetts that were behind the replacement of the cabins. That what we know of as the cabins from the 70s and 80s and 90s were because state regulations changed for square footage, for how far apart, for whatever, so that the cabin, the village organization for the 50s and 60s, they all sort of exploded, so the village circle, if you will, was larger. I don't know that that was the same reason for the dining hall and the new waterfront. I suspect not, but they were all tied together somehow. And that was a lot of fundraising. And then of course the Y turned around and had to then do it again at Chimney Corners. I think part of it had not been addressed for a long time. I mean, I think in '64 when I got there, the newest building on the property was the business office, which was 12 years old,
Right.
which had been built for the half centennial. So there was probably a lot of things were out of date, and that was probably a little piece of why enrollment had fallen a little bit. The facilities weren't sort of maintained. Jerry Courtney tells of talking to Don on the phone after Jerry had been here for a while, to talk to him about all this new construction, and Don saying, "Well, Jerry, I'm really glad you're paying attention to all that stuff. I didn't pay attention to that building stuff very much at all. I'm glad you are." So some of it's driven by state law, and some of it's
Well, it's part of it's cyclical. I mean,
Right.
you go back to the history of the camp, and it really is every 20 or 30 years, there's a very big construction boom or redoing because it's time to change buildings or upgrade the buildings. So I think part of that was driven by that. And then you mentioned that after the 60s and Camp Becket went through it, well, of course, in '72, Chimney Corners was acquired and in desperate need of all that. So
of all that stuff.
So the end of Don's reign, really, the money probably wasn't there and the focus wasn't there to do it at Becket anymore.
So, for example, having a Becket construction cabin turned out probably long-term to be a really good strategy for keeping up with some of that renewal stuff. Now, certainly not for the big projects, but when you look around camp and look at all the things that have been built in both camps, as a camper learning experience over the summer, it's really amazing how much has been accomplished to just stay ahead of the curve. And there were people who didn't like the cabins that were built in the 60s for all the same reasons that there are some people who aren't sure they like the cabins that are being built in 2003. Same stories. There were campers in Iroquois Village, counselors in Iroquois Village, who wouldn't use the counselor's room in the new cabins because they didn't want to be isolated from the campers. It was too big, it was too far away. Nobody complained about the screens on the cabins, but they questioned why the cabins were wired for electricity even though it was never used. It's just cheaper to build it in at that point in case the state mandated it. But they were too big. The cabin, especially in Iroquois, the circle was too big. The kids were too small. The loss of intimacy. Who needs all that room?
I'm sure in the 40s when the first cabins replaced the tents,
I'm
they were
sure.
right next to each other, had the same discussions.
I'm sure it was the same. Well, some of the same people.
I don't have anything else.
On a lighter side, we're celebrating the centennial here in 2003. Perhaps you can tell us some of your recollections about you playing Henry Gibson in 1903, the play, The Big Show.
Oh yeah, that was one of the big shows that was not written by Dick Smith. It was written by Bill Daniel, who did in fact, I think, work on it all winter. And his source material was one of the books that Henry Gibson had written about sort of camping A to Z. At that point, the camp had one copy of that book, and Bill would never have been allowed to use that, especially as far away as South Carolina, if he hadn't been probably Don's best friend. I did find another copy of that book on eBay and bought it, however. It was a fictionalized version of the building, the starting of Camp Becket, with many historical liberties taken, right from when it was the Dalton sheep farm, right up until the indeterminate present. And there were roles for Henry Gibson and Henry Brown, who was the first nature director, was apparently a real hotshot from Yale.
Colby College.
Colby College, thank you. A professor who took on that role during the summer. And, of course, roles for Don and Moose, playing the first aides. Much of the material was lifted right out of the book. The toothbrush drill, I think, was astounding in its...
Tell us about the toothbrush drill.
Well, I mean, Henry Gibson sort of codified everything there was. I mean, he really was one of the people who was able to say why you should have resident camping and how it should work. And so he wrote down everything from how to build the platform tents to what to cook, to how to get rid of the sewage, to the cheers and the songs that you would sing after dinner. He wrote down everything. And apparently there was a drill with a little chant that went to it to help you do a thorough job of brushing your teeth. And we could all look it up in that book if we had one here. It was like all the big shows. Well, Dick Smith always used to say there were only 6 or 8 good plots ever written, and Shakespeare got there first. So every big show basically was a small morality play of a sort. And I think that 1903 was no exception. It was a lighthearted look at the founding of the camp, all set to the terribly fashionable then tunes of Burt Bacharach, which were not nearly as easy to sing as they were to listen to. But like all big shows, it was filled with in-jokes, none of which lasted probably more than about 3 weeks. And a good time was had by all. And I got to play Henry Gibson.
Did not anybody call you, anybody on the fact that Henry Gibson was not there in 1903 at the camp?
Oh, liberties were taken throughout. You know, some passing reference. Like most big shows, if you were, unless you were a camper, if you were a staff member appearing in the big show, you always found a way to carry a clipboard to make you look like a camp staff member, and it usually had the script on it, so.
Anything else, or? You got anything else for us, Brent?
I always say it was one of the luckiest things that ever happened to me, was sort of taking that ride in that old car up to Mount Washington one day in the end of April, and just being in the right place at the right time. I know that I've been other places. In fact, just recently I was at a neighborhood potluck, which happened periodically, and I wore my vest that has the Becket logo on it. And somebody pulled himself out of the crowd and picked right up on it and wanted to know how I was connected with camp, because he'd been working with a camp on the South Shore, and did I know Don Schellenberger, and he knew Don, and he thought Don was his mentor, even though this guy is now, well, considerably younger than Don was. Sort of who knew, and I sort of was, well, in the best possible way, guilty by association. I mean, all of a sudden I was a much better person in this guy's eyes because I was wearing this insignia on a vest. And that's happened to me enough times to know that the camp is a really incredible place, and it has a much bigger reputation than I think some of us know. I found that Don took me, when I was the president of the Alumni Association, he took me to a meeting at the National Y in Chicago. I was a president of the Alumni Association. The Alumni Association was kind of not terribly well organized, and this was a meeting of 30 YMCA camps from all over the country who were each bringing one volunteer, that was me, to try to do a better job at understanding how to keep people connected and what was a meaningful way to do that. However it worked, Don and I flew separately to Chicago. I got there before he did. I didn't know anyone. They all seemed to have known each other. Don arrived late. The next morning, Don wasn't just the camp director that was with me. He was the keynote speaker. And after lunch, he left, leaving me for the other day and a half on my own. And I think it's at that point when I realized we were not the only good YMCA camp in the world. There were a lot of other really terrific places. But for some reason, the little niche that we had was just a little notch better in a lot of ways. And I kept thinking, why are they treating me what I perceived as a little bit deferentially? And I figured some of that had to do with Don. But I think some of it was just the longevity and the long-term reputation that the camp held in the camping community. And I think for a lot of summer staff, they may never get hooked into that other group of people who are in it full-time to ever see that. And so that was really sort of interesting, and made me feel even better about having just gone to the Berkshires every summer.
Did you ever wish you were a camper there?
Yeah, I don't know that I ever thought about that. I went to another YMCA camp when I was small for a couple of years, no long-term commitment, and I had a really good time at that other place. I guess that would have been cool, but I had a perfectly good time as a quasi-adult, so that I didn't worry about that, I guess.
All right. Thank you very much, Brent.
You're very welcome.
Nice job.
Cut tape.